I think the best thing that the anti-doping authorities can do is test those athletes as much as possible when the doors are open.
This is TSN In Depth. I'm Rick Westhead, joined by TSN's Dave Naylor, Paul Melia from the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sports, and Hilary Stellingwerff. Hilary competed for Canada in the Olympics in 2012 and 2016. Hilary, you've become a huge advocate for anti-doping efforts, and maybe you can explain why.
Sure. My personal experience was from the 2012 London Olympics, where I was the last one not to make the final. And then later it was found that 6 out of the 12 people in the final had either tested positive or had allegations of doping. And so it just made for a pretty disappointing situation where I moved from 15th to 9th and should have had the opportunity to compete in that final.
So what was the cost to you? Had you made the final, had you had a chance to build your profile in Canada and compete for a medal, what might have been different for you?
Yeah, there's financial implications with sponsors, with prize money and appearance fees at other events that follow on. In Canada specifically, our funding is based on top 8 as like the medalist, top 8, top 16. You get funding additionally on top of karting. So that would have put me at a new tier and allowed me to access some new funds. And I think it's more just I didn't feel like I got the chance to see how good I could be in that final, and that's more what I look back on, more so than the money lost. But of course, that's significant too.
One of the things about moving the Olympics to 2021 is there are athletes that would have been ineligible to compete in the Summer Games had they been held this year. They will be eligible because the time is dropping off their suspensions. Hilary, how do you feel about that as a former athlete and now coach?
Yeah, that's really frustrating, and I think that that's tough, but I don't know if we can change the rules. I think the best thing that the anti-doping authorities can do is test those athletes as much as possible when the doors are open and really get a handle. And I'm sure they will be, because there's a target on their back. And now we know that no competitions are happening and you can't qualify for the Olympics until I think December. There's been a hold. So there's not going to be athletes having the opportunity to qualify as much as previously, and so hopefully that affects things as well.
Amid this lockdown where there is no out of competition testing, how concerned are you that there are athletes and coaches and trainers who are going to try to use this to their advantage?
Yeah, I think that it is for sure concern, because there's less testing going on, and there are going to be athletes that will take advantage and systems that will take advantage. I'm more confident that the blood passport can help in being able to test athletes later if they did decide to take advantage of the situation, if they've been tested before. So if there's a profile on them before, then there's comparisons, and that's a great method that we didn't have previously. Where it could become an issue is with new athletes that don't have a profile. And for example, that's what happened for the 2012 silver medalist in the women's 1500. Is she was a new athlete, she was 18, they didn't have a previous passport on her, so they needed more data. So when you have new athletes that take advantage of this and they kind of pop out of nowhere, that's the challenge, is that the blood passport isn't as advantageous until later. There's going to be athletes that take advantage of it, but I do think that our system of testing is way, way stronger than it was 10 years ago. And so we can still catch more athletes than we would have previously in this situation.
Paul, with the lack of in-person doping tests, what is the potential to unseat the effectiveness of doping control?
Well, it's true that we've suspended our testing program, but it's not completely a doping-free season for athletes who may want to cheat. We do have our report doping hotline where we receive information and we open up cases and we conduct investigations. We so often see that it is the athletes themselves who best know which athletes may or probably are doping. We saw that in the Lance Armstrong situation, where those teammates provided the evidence that was able to get the doping violation against Lance. We didn't get a specimen on him. He was so good at beating the system that way. but the athletes knew. And other athletes in other sports, have said the same thing. Becky Scott back in Salt Lake City, said, I know those other athletes were doping. She wasn't supported at that time, but the facts came out and she was right. And we have much better ability to go back in time now with our laboratory tests. Hilary's brought it up as well. Many athletes are on the biological passport. So we would have collected, not just in Canada, but this is required by the IAAF, or Global Athletics as they're called now, and other sports, right? To have those athletes have biological passports. And so testing would have happened with them over the course of a year, 4 different tests at 4 points in time to establish their normal parameters in blood and in urine. And so any deviation that's picked up later will be compared to that. And based on that, we will be able to assert a doping violation has occurred. So, it's not open season the way you might think on the surface.
Paul, what is the advantage for someone doping right now, or what could be the advantage for someone doping when they know that there won't be any in-person tests for months to come?
Partly, it's hard to quantify that, given that there aren't scheduled competitions coming up, and there is a restriction on the kind of training that athletes can do to supplement doping. But at the same time, we have always been very careful not to provide athletes with information that they might use to help facilitate their doping. So, I'd rather not get into any of those specifics. It's not necessarily as ideal a time to dope as, one might naturally think.
What is your take on virtual drug testing? What is your thought about its effectiveness?
This is a small pilot project that the United States Anti-Doping Agency is conducting during this COVID-19 pandemic. It doesn't conform to the World Anti-Doping Code and the international standard regarding testing. So any data, any sample evidence that might come from that wouldn't be able to be asserted as a doping violation. But it could have broader implications, because you have to appreciate how intrusive the anti-doping program is and the testing is for athletes. They've had to provide us with their whereabouts. They have to let us know where they are all the time, 24/7. And then we do door knocks at their home, right? And we come in and we collect blood and urine from them. We witness, the passing of the urine sample. I mean, how intrusive is that into the personal and private lives of individuals? USADA is not naive. They're looking at, how can we overcome those? Let's time the person in the bathroom. Let's make sure the urine is at the temperature it would be at when it comes out of the body. Those kinds of things. And let's have an eye on the athlete at all other times through FaceTime or Zoom. But anything that can make the process less intrusive but still be reliable, I'm all for, as long as we don't lose the confidence we have in the reliability of the testing.
Paul, we know that not all countries are the same when it comes to the culture of doping. And of course, we have countries where the sport authorities are trying to be advocates for anti-doping, as we see in Canada. And we also have cultures where there's state-sponsored doping. How much more potential do you think there is where there are countries that not only with the athletes or their coaches might want to take advantage of this, but actually, a sport federation might want to?
For the most part, those athletes or those countries that are involved in, statewide, state-sponsored, system-wide doping, this is allowing them to do so, without having to look over their shoulder quite as much, maybe. But I don't think that in this period, necessarily a lot of countries or a lot of athletes or a lot of teams have turned their mind to, let's dope now because, there's been a suspension of testing. So, that risk is there regardless of whether we're running the testing program or not. And the challenges of getting into those countries and ensuring that the World Anti-Doping Code is being applied properly. I mean, that's the real challenge. That's what we face in countries like Russia and China, to a certain extent Kenya. It's difficult to get in and find the athletes and test them on a no-notice basis.
Why is that? Why is it so difficult to get into Russia and find an athlete to have them tested?
What we have found at an international level, they had so many missed tests. And then they would identify athletes in certain cities and they would go there, and these were closed cities, closed for military purposes, can't go in, no one can go in. But guess what? That's where a lot of the athletes were training. So it is a real challenge. And I think the World Anti-Doping Agency, as they try to ensure compliance with the code, they have to address these challenges and find ways to overcome them.
Paul, in the past in Russia, we know now through the McLaren report and through Dick Pound's investigation, the thousands of Russian athletes in recent years were able to compete and, while cheating. What's the culture in Russia now, from your understanding?
It's hard to have any confidence in Russia at this point, from my perspective, because when the evidence, which was overwhelming, compelling, and largely irrefutable, the roadmap was created for Russia to get back in, for their anti-doping agency to become code compliant. In that roadmap were two conditions, in among many others, but one was you've got to provide us with the data in the lab that will help us corroborate McLaren's report and help us identify individual athletes. And the second was that the Russian government had to acknowledge the McLaren report and the state-sponsored involvement in the doping program. Well, on the eve of the date that they had to comply, they negotiated a deal with WADA. They said, well, let us in now in September 2018, and by December, we'll give you that lab data. And we won't acknowledge the McLaren report, but we'll acknowledge the IOC's report, which was a much softer report and didn't really point to the state-sponsored involvement. And then when they finally presented WADA with the lab data, we found that the lab data was manipulated by Russia. So here you have a country, a government, a sports system that's really not acknowledging and taking responsibility for what they did. And of course, they control the media in Russia as well. And so no doubt they're suggesting to those athletes that all the other countries are doing that. They're just not getting caught, or, you're just not hearing about it. And so, I mean, I don't have confidence that Russia is committed to clean sport.
Hilary, how does that make you feel hearing that the Russian government's message to its own athletes would be, in Canada, athletes like Hilary and others, they're cheating too. This is just what you need to do to keep up.
Oh, I'm not surprised. I'm not naive to that at all. I've even heard other athletes from other countries say the same thing about systemic doping in their own countries, saying that, well, everyone else is doing the same thing, so why shouldn't we? So that's not surprising. There's some flexing of the muscles happening on a political scale when it comes to systemic doping. And if that's the norm and that's what you're told and everything that you're reading or hearing is controlled, then I'm not surprised that that's the messaging happening, and we can't control that.
It's about 30 years ago, almost 30 years ago, I broke into this business, and there was something called the Dublin Inquiry that was going on, right? Which I think ultimately led to the creation of Center for Ethics in Sport. And maybe I'll direct this one to you, Hilary. At that time, it seemed like a real awakening, that Canada was kind of waking the world up to the realities of doping. And I just wonder, for people who look at this sort of from a distance and see all that going on, those many years ago, and then hear your story about competing against a half dozen athletes in 2012 who are all doping, it can make it feel sometimes like the fight is futile. Do you ever feel that way?
Yeah, sometimes. In the last several years, when you start to hear about the number of athletes that have been found to have tested positive or have abnormal passports, it is shocking, and it can really jade your idea of the sport. And I think it has for a lot of people. But at the same time, there are clean athletes trying to do their best, and the doping testing has gotten better. They're catching more athletes. That's why it's coming out. So I do think that that's a positive thing, even though it makes our sport and other sports look really bad. You kind of got to leave it to the anti-doping authorities to do their job and just try to run faster, compete well.
A really interesting conversation today. Thanks both Paul and Hilary for joining Dave and I and talking about it.